Good morning, everyone. Welcome to this morning's session on how reverse mentoring can help break down barriers and create a more inclusive workplace. I'm going to start this presentation by showing you a problem statement. So hopefully you can see this diagram. This illustrates the problems leaders in our organizations have to face today. So as a leader, our most senior leaders are unaware of 96% of the problems in their organization. This comes from a 1989 study, 96%. So to just reiterate that, the people making decisions driving our organizations have very little visibility into the actual problems they're trying to solve. On the other hand, people who deal with customers on a day-to-day basis, who are on the front line, are completely aware of these problems. The problem happens with leadership. As you become a leader, you become less aware of the problems you're trying to solve. Even though the organization has the data you need, it's really difficult to unlock it. And as a leader, part of our job is to actually figure out, how do I find out these problems? How do I reach out to the people on the front line and get the data I need to make better decisions? By the end of this session, hopefully you will realize that reverse mentoring is a great tool you can use to do this. So my name is Bunmi Sowande. I lead the customer engineering team for our corporate segment in the UK and Ireland. I also recently completed an MBA from Warwick Business School. And for my dissertation, I completed a study on reverse mentoring. And that's the content which I'm going to share with you guys today. So I'll start with reverse mentoring. What is it? Share my personal story with reverse mentoring. Then I'll talk about how I conducted my research, and then I will share the results of that research as a series of recommendations. After that, we'll have some time to take some questions. So what is reverse mentoring? We'll start by looking at the traditional mentoring model. So in traditional mentoring, you have a mentee who is usually junior, so that's their position or their role, usually younger, and has less work experience. The mentor, on the other hand, usually more senior in role and position, tends to be older, and has usually accumulated more experience. Now, people change careers in later stages of life, so these descriptions might be different, but most of the time it's accurate. Now, during the mentoring process, the mentor transfers knowledge, experience, and guidance to their mentee. The goal is to get more positive career outcomes for their mentee. Now, with reverse mentoring, we invert that dynamic. So we are going to flip the labels, and our mentor is now the junior employee, or the younger or the less experienced employee, and our mentee is now the senior employee. So what happens is the transfer of knowledge changes, so it now goes in the opposite direction, and you're now transferring your knowledge, your perspective, your support, and feedback to your mentee. Now, the outcome of this is different, because what ends up happening is you usually get more positive career outcomes for both parties, so not just the mentee. So I'm going to use these labels for the rest of the conversation. So mentor will be referring to the person on this side, mentee will be referring to the person on that side. So let me share my personal story with reverse mentoring. If you've ever read Sheryl Sandberg's book, Lean In, there's a chapter called Will You Be My Mentor? And she talks about how she finds it awkward and off-putting when a woman approaches her out of the blue and asks her, will you be my mentor? Someone she's got no relationship with the person, just walk up to her. And she states in the book that if somebody has to ask her the question, the answer is almost definitely going to be no. But the truth is, there's a sliver of truth there, in that most people look for mentors that look like them or come from backgrounds similar to theirs. With reverse mentoring, it's a slightly different dynamic, but before I continue, people from underrepresented groups in general have fewer mentors in their careers. It's a huge, huge problem. So it's a slightly different dynamic. So I'm going to share a personal story. So in 2020, at the height of the pandemic, someone asked my wife, will you be my reverse mentor? Now, both of us had never heard of it, so we went online and researched it, and we realized that actually it might be something interesting. However, she felt she couldn't say no. This person was a C-level in her organization, very senior. He'd recently agreed to become the racial equality sponsor for the organization. But he was a white man who had grown up in rural Wales, so he had no idea of the lived experience of the group he was meant to be supporting. So he had a conversation with the chief people officer and asked for some advice, and she suggested reverse mentoring. Together, they identified my wife as a potential reverse mentor, and then he asked her the question. Now, 6 months later, fast forward, and he was now sharing back to the organization everything he'd learned in 6 months and how he'd put them into practice in his role as racial equality sponsor. This was during the pandemic, so basically this meeting happened in my living room, and I happened to overhear everything. But I remember listening to it, and it really, really struck me how much he'd learned in such a short time and how he'd actually put that into effect. And I suddenly realized this was something I wanted to experience myself. So at the time, I was considering moving into a management role. And one of the first things I said I would do as a manager was I would look for a reverse mentor. So that was 2020. I was working in a different team. And then in 2021, I started my new role as a manager. And I reached out to a colleague who was very familiar with reverse mentoring, and I asked her to nominate someone on her team to be my reverse mentor. Just before the pandemic, not that long, I had a meeting with a former colleague, and I left that meeting really struck because she explained a lot of what she had to put up with and how she had to change her behavior in the office just to fit in. And I remember leaving that meeting many years ago thinking, I don't want that to ever happen to a woman I work with again. But I then realized that my knowledge of the problems women face in the workplace was actually very skin deep, and I wanted to actually get a better perspective of how I could support women on my team. At the time, I had a team of 7 men. So I asked for a woman, but I also wanted to look into our recruitment process from the perspective of a candidate. So I asked for a woman who'd been hired recently, and I also wanted to look at the onboarding process we had for new engineers to see if there were any holes that I might need to plug as a new manager. So along came Esther into my life. So she was introduced to me as a potential reverse mentor. I asked her the question, and she said, yes, thankfully. So at the time, Esther had been in Google for about 4 months. She was completely new to sales, never worked in sales before. And I didn't know this, she was really struggling with imposter syndrome. But her manager told me she's a real high potential for us, and hopefully you can get what you want and help her at the same time. So we worked together for about a year, and we still meet on a regular basis. In terms of results, it's been extremely positive for both of us. So I achieved my goal of improving representation on my team, and I actually started a new role early this year as a senior management role. Esther interviewed me multiple times as I was preparing to do my interviews, and she looked through my CV and she gave me a lot of guidance. On the other hand, Esther's been incredibly successful in her time at Google. So one of the first conversations we had, she was looking for a more specialized role, and she moved into that role, I think a few months after we started working together. In that role, she's really, really thrived. She's been promoted twice in the last 2 years. So I've been very fortunate to be part of her journey, and I know there's still a lot more to come from her. So based on this experience, to me, I now had 2 very positive experiences of reverse mentoring. I was a huge fan. Now, I was doing an MBA at the time and getting to the point where I needed to pick a dissertation topic. I actually picked a different topic, but in my brief, I had a list of ways to drive diversity in the organization, and reverse mentoring was on that list. Somehow, the professor who was meant to just assign me a supervisor saw that and said, I've never heard of reverse mentoring. What is it? And then we started talking. 20 minutes into the conversation, he then said, stop. I think you're going to hate me, but I think you're writing the wrong topic. I think you should change your topic. This was going to set me back about a month or so, where he said, forget what your original topic was, reverse mentoring. This is what you should write about. In hindsight, it was obvious. I had a lot of knowledge about it. I was quite passionate about it. So in the end, it was kind of a no-brainer. And I listened, reflected, and I said, yep, I think I'll take your advice and I'll do the study on reverse mentoring. So going into the research, like I said earlier, my view of reverse mentoring was incredibly positive. This is still the case, but I've also realized that there are potential pitfalls that you need to watch out for. So I'll come to that later, but let me go into how I went about my research first. So first thing I did was I did a literature review, and I looked at any academic papers that had been written on reverse mentoring. I didn't have as many as most of my other classmates, but one thing I did notice was that there's a sudden spike from around 2018, and that's a little bit sustained going into 2021. So most of the research was written in the last 6 years or so. So when I looked into the history of reverse mentoring, I realized that most people think it was invented by Jack Welch, the legendary CEO of GE. So in 1999, he asked a lady called Pam Wickham, who was 37, to become his mentor. And they had regularly scheduled meetings, and those meetings were used to teach Jack Welch how to use this new technology called the internet. When he finished going through the reverse mentoring, he then asked the top 500 managers in GE to do exactly the same thing. He asked them to identify people to teach them how to use the internet because he thought that maybe this technology was going to change the way we work. So that's what most of the academic papers found. However, in reality, a year before that, the American Dietetic Association had already done this. So in 1998, they went into the universities and found students to reverse mentor their members on how to use the internet, the same thing. Now, at the beginning of reverse mentoring, most people used it to learn how to use technology that younger people tended to be more familiar with. So you see a lot of use for the internet, and moving forward, when social media became a thing, it was to teach some executives how to use social media more effectively. However, it now has a really strong link with diversity and inclusion, particularly inclusion. Because if our leaders are more aware of problems underrepresented groups are facing in the workplace, they can actually create an atmosphere that these people can thrive in. And I found this in my research and also when I did my interviews, which I'll come to shortly. Procter & Gamble was the first company in the academic research anyway that did this. So in 2005, they had this problem with attrition with their female employees. So they got all their senior managers, who were mostly men, to be reverse mentored by female employees, and it led to a much better understanding of the problems the women were facing in the workplace. Now, my favorite example of how reverse mentoring works was published in the British Medical Journal of all places in 2021. So, to state the problem they were looking to solve, there's a lot of diversity when you look at students in medical school in the UK. However, when you look at the field of doctors, when you move to where they've graduated, there is very little diversity in that group. What they realized was that there was very high attrition for people in certain communities, so certain racial backgrounds, and people that came from poor socioeconomic backgrounds. And they wanted to see what they could do as a university to improve that experience. So what they did was, for 3 months, they got students to reverse mentor the faculty of the university. So before that program started, the staff were asked to write a narrative about the higher education journey of an underrepresented medical student. After the reverse mentoring intervention, they were now asked to rewrite that narrative. So the first set of narratives revealed a very superficial understanding of that student journey. So, for example, they acknowledged that the students worked very, very hard to get to where they were, and that now that they were enrolled in medical school, everything was going to be fine. It was a fairy tale ending. they were going to get out of poverty because they were going to become doctors. And when the students dropped out, it was because of something wrong with them. The deficit was on the students. Maybe because nobody in their family had ever been to university, they didn't have anybody to help them, guide them through the university life. And in those fairy tale endings, the medical school had effectively rescued the students from the lives they were living. After just 3 or 4 meetings, because this was over just 3 months, there was a notable change in perception. So what ended up happening was they had a much deeper understanding, and there was a shift in responsibility. So the students were now seen as capable agents. They acknowledged that the students were actually operating in what was a challenging environment for them. The faculty had always been in a position to make things easier for the students. They just didn't realize the problems they were having. So the endings were a lot more pragmatic, and the medical school, getting there was great, but it created a whole new set of problems that these students weren't really equipped to handle. And the medical school was now seen as responsible. So they were the ones who had to come up with solutions, not the students. So a very practical issue raised at one of the meetings was that one of the students did not have a relative who earned enough money to guarantee his rent. So he was unable to get accommodation at the university. And now you can imagine what going to university with no accommodation will be like. But that's one of the reasons why a lot of these students were dropping out, was just no one could help them to underwrite their accommodation rent agreements. Now, there was one area that saw very little improvement, and that was around discrimination and racism. And it's a complex topic, but effectively, some of the faculty felt that the students were being a bit accusatory when they were saying, there's no staff member that looks like me, and that doesn't help me. So they got very, very defensive when they were talking about this topic, both in both narratives, before and after. But like I said, it was a 3-month program, so this is a much harder problem to solve. So with all this in mind, I decided to go into my research. The objectives were quite simple. What do people highlight when you talk about reverse mentoring? What motivates people to participate? And what is the best way to implement reverse mentoring? So I set about gathering data. So the summer of 2022, I conducted 19 interviews with people who had been mentees, mentors, and people who had organized reverse mentoring programs in different organizations across 3 different continents. I was lucky enough to find 4 reverse mentoring pairs. So I spoke to the mentor and the mentee in those pairs. And I was able to gather insights from both sides of those relationships. So in the interest of time, I'm going to share my findings in the form of recommendations. So I'll start with organizations looking to organize reverse mentoring. So the first step is recruitment. So you need to recruit your mentors and your mentees. For mentors, you need to select people really, really carefully. You're not looking for someone who vents a lot about problems. You want someone who can give constructive feedback to a senior leader rather than just use these meetings as a space to just complain. And for mentees, you're looking for people who are open to learning from people who they might regard as less experienced, younger. So you need someone who is very, very open to learning from other people, particularly people junior to them. While you can encourage people to sign up, it's it's problematic when it's compulsory, because that leads to a lot of behaviors that later down the line could cause problems. A reverse mentor should not be paired with someone who ultimately their manager reports to. This causes problems for both parties. The mentor will not be able to give honest feedback because they don't want to paint their manager in a bad light. And on the other hand, the mentor also experiences a lot of problems with their peers because any success they get, ultimately people will write it up to favoritism on the behalf of their mentee. And in 2 cases where I found this in my interviews, the mentees were not even aware of all the problems their mentors were facing because of the fact that the 2 of them were speaking together. A mentoring agreement is really useful. It sets out a number of things. So explaining exactly what each role does. One person I spoke to said their reverse mentor was looking for a traditional mentor and came in thinking that was what they were going to get. That relationship was ultimately unsuccessful because the mentee was looking to gain a lot of knowledge rather than being a traditional mentor. So it was the wrong program for the other party. So clearly stating what is expected for each role in that mentoring agreement goes a really long way. You can also talk about the cadence, suggested cadence for meetings, how long the mentoring relationship should last, and I've already talked about the roles. So having a suggested list of topics to discuss also helps. So for people that don't immediately have chemistry when they first meet, this list will give them some topics they can talk about so that the relationship can later on evolve into something more natural. But for some people who just immediately don't get on, this really, really helps. Now you have to be aware, for a reverse mentoring pair, you're looking for people that are different enough that they can learn from each other, but similar enough that they can actually talk to each other. So it's a really, really tricky thing to match people when you're doing this. The number one finding, however, in my research was that a lot of people were failing in the duty of care to the mentors. Now, with every single person I spoke to, except maybe one, the reverse mentoring program was actually designed around the leaders in the organization, so the mentees. So the mentors, in some cases, were almost an afterthought. So the other thing I've talked about is, for most people, when you get approached by a senior leader to become their reverse mentor, it's really, really hard to say no. So a lot of the mentors were acting out of obligation. Some of them were not enjoying the reverse mentoring, but they had no one that could help extract them from those relationships. And then in some cases, the organizations that were running reverse mentoring, they were asking the mentees for regular feedback. How is it getting on? What are you learning? But nobody thought to ask the mentors. So nobody actually sat down with them and said, how is it going? Are you getting anything out of this? How is your relationship going? So nobody was doing that check. And as a result, a lot of mentors were suffering in silence, as it were. There was one case where the mentor said he felt like a textbook. So this gentleman is paralyzed from the neck down. He'd reverse mentored a lot of people in the past, but he had this particular mentee who literally went line by line through their disability guide and was asking for his opinion on stuff. Didn't even bother forming a relationship. He was just interested in the information he could get. And that was a really uncomfortable experience. And he said, look, at that point, I just counted down to the end of the relationship, but I couldn't wait for this to end. Now, one other thing that I found is, if your reverse mentoring program is designed around an underrepresented group, by definition, you're talking about a very small population of your organization, just by definition. So what most organizations did was they used the same mentors again and again and again. Now, for a lot of these people, they were describing times that they'd gone through really difficult experiences, discrimination, racism in some cases, where people had treated them unfairly. And they found that the reverse mentoring was effectively making them relive, in some cases, trauma again and again and again. And what some organizations did, so 2 organizations I found had identified this problem quite early. So one of them ended up giving reverse mentors 2-year breaks between relationships just to allow them to recover mentally. The other one incorporated the reverse mentoring into their graduate program. So that meant that they had a steady stream of new mentors every year. And then there's a third method which another organization used, but I'll talk about that later on. Now, in one organization, they had a reverse mentoring scheme that was based on race. And everything I just talked about happened. And in the end, 5 of the reverse mentors resigned. And they actually stated that they were resigning because of the reverse mentoring program. One of them said he felt like his mentees treated him like a Black history professor. And he just got tired of it. They felt they weren't gaining anything from the reverse mentoring. And this wasn't quite true. The organization was changing, but they didn't actually feel the effects of it. And in the end, those relationships were one direction. So the mentees were gaining a lot, The organization was gaining a lot. The one person who was suffering was the mentor. When reverse mentoring works at its best, it's bi-directional. So both parties gain. So the examples I gave you earlier illustrate how it's actually relatively easy to do it in a way that both people gain. So the one thing I didn't mention about my wife is since that reverse mentoring, she got promoted and she's now actually a director in our organization. So in both cases that I was familiar with, and in most of the people I interviewed, a lot of people actually gain from participating in reverse mentoring. But in this particular organization, they were really, really struggling when they had this. Effectively, the reverse mentors came as a group and asked to end the program. Now, mentors, like I said, act out of obligation, but not just that. Some of them are actually, they are quite sacrificial. So a lot of people I spoke to said, I'm doing this to make sure that the next women that join this organization don't have to go through what I went through. I spoke to someone in the military who said, I'm doing this to make sure that the next people who come and join this organization after I leave have a much better experience than I did. So they have that sacrificial approach, and in many cases, they're not even aware that they could potentially gain from the relationships. So one piece of advice I'll give you is when you're designing a reverse mentoring program, the easy thing to do is to design it around your mentees. But consider putting your mentors at the center instead. That really, really does help because both parties will eventually gain. But if you're more deliberate about centering it on your mentors, so possibly even making a bi-directional program from the beginning, it's a lot more effective. So what do organizations benefit from when they go through reverse mentoring? You get improved retention, so there's less attrition, not just your mentors, but your mentees, and I'll come back to that at the end of the presentation. You get leadership development. The organization I spoke to who incorporated reverse mentoring into their graduate program said, and they called it an unexpected benefits, was it really, really enhanced the graduate program. They said it enriched it because all of a sudden they realized that these people were joining the organization and very quickly understanding the politics, the structure, information that would have taken them years to actually accumulate, they were getting it in just a few months. But it was really interesting that to them, they never actually saw it as a benefit. It was an unintended benefit. So you get better, more inclusive, more informed leaders going forward. You remember the iceberg of ignorance I started with? And your organization becomes more networked. So you're creating links across your organization that wouldn't normally exist. People who wouldn't normally be friends are now friends across seniority levels, across different age groups, across different teams even. So if somebody asks you, would you be my reverse mentor? Like I said, most people can't feel that they can't say no. But a lot of mentors are filled with doubt. If you're like any of the people I speak to, you're terrified. There's a lot of pressure. What do I have to give? The truth is, you would not have been approached if you had nothing to offer. So don't doubt yourself. You may not have the experience your mentee has. This is fine. This is normal. But the truth is, you can actually contribute a lot to the relationship. Your lived experience is unique to you, and that's what your mentee wants to learn about. So those first few meetings might be awkward, but if you push through, you'll start to get more comfortable and more confident. Don't be afraid to ask your mentee for advice or guidance. A lot of the mentors I spoke to, they felt they couldn't do it because as far as they were concerned, the program was designed to help their mentee, and they really felt that they couldn't ask for career advice themselves. But don't be afraid. A lot of the mentees I spoke to were so grateful for what they gained from their mentors that they were looking to actually see what they could do to help already. And a lot of these questions that were never asked were opportunities for the mentees that just went without any help. Now, for mentees, the best mentees I found were people who had that real hunger to learn. People who felt that, there's a lot I can actually gain from this, and they went into those programs really open to learn from their mentors. Look to see how you can help your mentor. Give back. So your mentor is not a textbook. I can't state that enough. Your mentor is not a textbook. They're not there to just help you. Look for opportunities. If you do anything, in your organization that you got the idea from your mentor, credit them with that. And your mentor needs to trust you before they open up. So that will not happen automatically. You will need to work at it. And in my research, there were 3 things the best mentees did in order to gain that trust. The first was prioritizing time with mentors. So there was a mentor who he said he would walk into his mentee's office and they would be doing a meeting. He would end the meeting and kick everybody out just to meet with him. That made him feel really, really important. Another person said he would actually be invited to sit down, observe the meeting, and when they started their own meeting, the mentee would start with saying, right, give me feedback on how you felt I acted in that meeting. And all of a sudden, you're like, okay, if he's taking things this seriously, I need to take things seriously. Be present during the meetings. These are not times for you to start multitasking and doing email while you're talking. So the best mentees ended up, they would be very, very focused, notes, sometimes taking notes, but fully attentive, playing back what they'd heard. And then finally, the best mentees were people who, they took what they'd learned and put it into action. There was one great example of, there was a living allowance for people, for graduates living in London that was no longer economically viable. So the mentor mentioned this in one of their first meetings. The mentee went and investigated and realized it hadn't been reviewed for years. So he approached the HR team, they reviewed it, and before their next meeting, he was happy to tell the mentor that, good news, that has been revised, and starting from next month, you'll be getting a lot more money. That small action he took led to a massive outpouring of support from his mentor, and their relationship just went in leaps and bounds. So many other examples. There was another lady who, a customer had been effectively very racist and very sexist towards her. She reported it to her manager, but her manager felt that because it was a paying customer, the company couldn't do anything. So this had happened 2 years prior. When she mentioned it to her mentee, he was livid. And he went back to the company and said, we need to support our people when these things happen. We can't just sweep them under the carpet. And then he took action, and then they later outlined policies so that in the future, if a customer treats an employee badly, there was a process to be followed. So in conclusion, when I started the research, I was incredibly positive. Like I said, there's a lot of pitfalls, as I found out. But I'm pleased to say that the organization that had a lot of people resign have really turned things around. So they had a number of changes. So they implemented it as their new program as a bi-directional program. They had an innovative way of increasing the population of underrepresented groups by opening up the program to people who weren't in their organization. So they invited other companies to take part in that bi-directional program. And in the last 2 years, they've not only seen increased retention, but what they've seen, which they didn't get with the previous program, is a lot of the people in the underrepresented groups are now progressing faster through the organization. So they're really, really pleased with the results. And with that in mind, I would urge you to give reverse mentoring a go. It's cost effective in that it literally doesn't cost you anything. There's benefits to everyone. Like I said, you will need to prepare. Look after your mentors. If you look at the group, mentors, mentees, organizations, they've got the least agency, and as a result, they will need your support. So make sure you're looking after your mentors. Remember that duty of care. And then finally, on engagement, a lot of senior leaders, particularly those closer to the end of their career than the beginning, it's really, really hard to find genuine training and development opportunities for them. Reverse mentoring is a genuine learning and development tool that you can use with anyone. And for a lot of this group in particular, they find that there's increased engagement simply because they're now understanding a lot more about different generations, understanding a lot more about the organization, and they're able to actually be more effective at work. It networks across seniority levels. And then the other thing reverse mentoring does is when you have organizational diversity, you can actually harness it. So you have a lot of companies talk about building diverse organizations. You hire all these people, but you're not actually tapping into what they bring into your organization. Reverse mentoring actually allows you to do that. So thank you very much for your time this morning. I just wanted to signpost a couple of other sessions in the DEI track happening today. Please, please, please give me some feedback when you get a chance.